What were your impressions of him? Can you recall those for us?
He was very talented. He's made his name, of course, in pop music, but he wrote poetry, he designed posters, he painted, he was very keen on salmon fishing, had many interests, and he was good at many things.
What was his scholastic record like?
He narrowly failed in every subject he took in external examinations, but that was merely because he attached no importance to passing. I think it rankled with him a little in later years from one or two things he said, but he's certainly a very intelligent boy who could have passed with ease if he'd wanted to.
There's no suggestion from what I see around the school here that it's a working class school, and yet John seemed to have working class values.
I would have said that is a myth, that John had a lower middle class upbringing, if you must put a label on John. I think it's been convenient for some people to describe him as working class, but no, I don't think so. There are many working class children here, but we have the normal distribution in the state school, that is to say a school where fees aren't paid.
And you were responsible for getting John into our school, as he suggested.
Well, I discussed with John and with his aunt what he should do, and I had a word with the principal of the art college, who didn't later on thank me for it, and he did go to art college, and that's what he was referring to in his letter.
But you saw something in him that...
Oh, he had great talent. It didn't take any great perceptiveness to realise that.
Is there any resentment about the Beatles in Liverpool?
Some party politicians reproach him for having left Liverpool and not having returned.
And that's...
They oppose the raising of a fund to build a statue or the naming of streets after him.
Would you say that's a widely held attitude?
Not widely, no.
What would you think Liverpool's attitude was about?
I think that in general people have a sentimental admiration for him. They were certainly shocked at the manner of his death. And I think most people would like to see him commemorated. Most people want to think well of John. John has told the truth about his life in his writings. He's given an unvarnished account. I don't think people want to hear him criticised. I think they would want to be proud of him.
Alan, could you tell us how that came about?
Well, it looks like I'm stuck with it till the grave. My son said to me, just going off the track for a minute, Dad, he's 16, he said, I hope I'm not going to be known as the son of the man who gave the Beatles away. That's how worried the family are about this tag of mine.
John Lennon started the Beatles.
Oh, yes, yeah, there's no doubt about it. Paul was a very late member of the group, even in the Quarry days. We've reached the stage of me calling these boys who used to play truant coffee bar layabouts, because they would sit all day on one cup of coffee. And I was having trouble with the public health authorities because of the obscene graffiti in the ladies' toilets. Because also where groups will go, there'll always be groupies, girls who follow the groups. And they used to write obscene comments about certain parts of the body of the groups in the toilets. Now, I shared my toilets in the daytime with the local shop next door to me, which was a news agent, which had middle-aged ladies serving, and they complained about the state of the toilets. So I was issued with an ultimatum: either I close the club or, clean up my toilets. So knowing that these lads, two of them were from the arts college, I thought, well, if they can paint art, they must be able to paint, with a brush. So I asked them, would they care to paint the ladies' toilets? And of which they said, yes, how much? John, of course, how much? So I paid them £10 and they redecorated. That was the first contact I made with them. And by the way, they made a marvellous job of the toilets. It so confused the Public Health Authority that he wanted to close me for the psychedelic sort of paintings that they did on the wall.
Was Liverpool a tough area at that time?
Oh, yes, yeah. It was, it's always been known for its violence. And...
Give me an example of violence. What do you mean by violence?
Well, everywhere they played, it would finish up in a fight. In actual fact, one place that I sent him to play over the water, even in 1960, there was a lad beaten up and booted to death at the very dance that they were playing in Heswell.
Were the Beatles
used to send him to one place over the water where they used to have to hide behind the piano because the popular thing was to throw the chairs at the group. And at one stage, I sent them over to a Grosvenor ballroom where their drummer had left them, and they had to play without a drummer. Paul used to fancy himself on drums a bit, but John made the mistake of going on stage and said, "Is there a drummer in the house?"
Alan, the early days of the Beatles in Hamburg are the source of many stories about them. For example, it's reported that the Beatles swore, fought, burped, and passed wind on stage. Is this true?
Well, that's putting it mildly. I can remember the time when one drunken kraut tried to get on stage, and John Lennon was eating on stage, and he threw his knife at him. And then, not deterring the fellow, he just promptly kicked him in the face to boot him off the stage. Stories like this were rife because, you see, they were on pills at the time then because they used to work, you know, pep pills, because the hours that they used to work, they used to start something like 8 o'clock in the evening on a Saturday and finish at 3 o'clock. Now, at that period was the gun running between the Algerian War, the French-Algerian War, and Hamburg was the main port. And also, the Eastern Wall had gone up, you know, the famous Berlin Wall, which drove all the gangsters into Hamburg from East Germany. And so you had this town full of gangsters who used to love the Beatles and used to send them crates of ale on stage, and they'd be legless, absolutely legless on stage. It reached the stage at one period that they were that bad on stage. Lennon, he hated the Germans, used to call them krauts, cursed them, used to do Sieg Heil and anti-Hitler's words and all this to them, that they actually brought the curtain down on them and sacked them. And this was the time, I'd finished with them at this stage, it was at the Star Club. And Brian Epstein had to go over and get them reinstated. But there were very, very wild times in Hamburg.
Cavern disc jockey.
Bob, how did you get on with Brian Epstein?
Fine, he was a very nice fellow.
What did he have to do with the cabin?
Oh, nothing. It wasn't his. He just went down one day to see this group that he'd heard about, and he used to pop in quite frequently. His record store is just down the road here.
Was it at the cabin he first saw the Beatles?
Yes.
And was it Lennon that he was taken with?
Well, I don't know, really. I wasn't there alongside of him. I do know this, that he came, he saw, and he was conquered, either by them collectively, their sound, or whatever.
Did he mention to you about what his feelings were for the Beatles? Did he ask you about them, or...?
Well, of course, he asked me what I thought of them, and I told him in no uncertain terms that I felt that they were absolutely brilliant, and all they needed was management.
Do you think it was Brian's handling of the group that was responsible for their success, or do you think they would have done it regardless of who the manager was?
No, they needed somebody like Brian Epstein who would put up with their whims, their problems, and the problems they created themselves. They were not easy. Well, they were not easy to get on with at times because they would come late to performances, and you know, that took some indulging.
What about Pete Best?
Yes.
What happened to Pete?
Well, they booted him out. There was a disagreement in the group about him.
What was the disagreement over?
I think it was a personality clash. There is one Lennon incident. I know you're interested in Lennon more than the other Beatles. This indicates his style of sense of humor. I'm in the band room with him, with the Beatles, you see, playing records, and one of the Beatles amp humpers, they used to carry the gear in, came into the band room, and I said, oh, look who's here, it's Bernie, the original thalidomide kid, which was a very unkind thing. He wasn't in any way thalidomide. But John Lennon just fell about because, you see, that appealed to him, that very offbeat, bizarre sense of humor which he had. And I thought, well, now that I've got a little insight into what makes you tick, because that's his style of humor. A bit sick in a way, you know, because he used to do a spastic act on stage. Did you know that?
But was it John that you had a disagreement with?
Yeah, it was a totally unprovoked attack, and he really let fly. So I know what being on the receiving end of, you know, our peace-loving John Lennon.
Was he physically violent?
Oh yes, yeah.
So you've forgiven him for it, or?
Oh, it was one of those episodes that you expect from volatile people. He was a hard knock with a soft centre, really. But most of the time, he would portray his hardness, you see. Because, for one thing, it was fashionable to appear mean. You know, the meanness that was coming across from rock and roll, which is part of the rock and roll image, and he certainly lived up to it.
What was the stage act of particularly Lennon like at the Cavern?
Oh, he commanded the stage. Do you remember him, the way he stood? His legs would be wide apart. That was one of his trademarks, and of course it was regarded as being very sexual. And the girls at the front, they would be kind of looking up his legs, keeping a watch on the crotch, as it were. And that was a very aggressive stance that he adopted.
Could you say that John Lennon was the force behind the Beatles?
Well, it's not easy to say that. He complimented McCartney, and in turn, Harrison and the drummer complimented each other. I always felt that of all the groups that have formed during the 60s, that the Beatles was, in a way, perfect casting, because they were contrasting, and yet they complemented each other. But to say that without Lennon, you wouldn't have had the Beatles, well, of course, that would be true. But at the same time, that would go for McCartney, Harrison, and I suppose Ringo.